You might agree that the Intercessor kill team has a bit of a simple look to it, but that does make it the perfect canvas for kitbashing something awesome. This led me to the idea of Space Marine Scavengers, who use a combination of Loyalist and inherited gear to replace the armor they can no longer fix. And as you can see by the previous 2 members, they're turning out pretty awesome already. So let's make the remaining 4 members and make this a full kill team. For this project, I curated several pieces that I thought would match the Scavenger aesthetic. One of the most interesting is this missile launcher that I'm planning to count as an under-barrel grenade launcher instead, with the bolter and his other arm. As this was the first of the 4 models I was making, I had several choices as to what body to pick. The left one had a standard pose, but I chose to go with the right one, as the slight lean in his pose made it look much more authentic to the fact that he's hauling around this very massive grenade launcher. Fortunately, this arm did not require any modifications, and all I had to do was just use a little bit of sprue glue to make sure it's secure fit, and with the second arm attached, adding on the pauldron. For the head, I found this really awesome looking one, though I'm not sure where it's from. I love the fact that it's not an instantly recognizable helmet and it looks slightly modified, adding to the Scavenger aesthetic. And given the massive size of bolter rounds, why not have massive grenade launch rounds too? Though I'm not sure how he would actually reach it by himself through the back, perhaps somebody's actually going to be assisting him with that. But for now, I did drill out the bolter just to ensure that he actually had some way to use it, and reattach my grenade launcher rounds that unfortunately peeled off during the process. The first member was done, but there was a lot more work up ahead, as the rest of them would require a lot more modification. I looked through my bits and picked up the 2 arms that I thought would be a great match for an Intercessor. Giving him a melee weapon will make this pose a lot more dynamic, but it's also going to make it a lot easier for me to paint him. As with an open body, you don't have to worry about the fact that you need to try to reach out behind the bolter. My original instinct was to go for a movie pose where the bolter is pointing upwards, however I thought that it would be a lot more logical to have it point downwards. With the shoulder pad, I decided to do some heavy modification. In the previous video, I got a great suggestion to add some heavy damage to the shoulder pad, as well as reveal what's underneath it. I started by drilling a hole so my massive head trimmers had a really easy way to get in there. From here, I did my best to destroy as much of the shoulder pad as possible without compromising the structural integrity of it. I used the X-Acto blade to get rid of all the little tiny bits of loose plastic. Then I took some drywall tape, thinking it would be an interesting idea, similar to the suggestion, which was to use a netting texture to create the idea that the internal parts of the pauldron are visible through the damage. Unfortunately, no matter how hard I tried, the texture was just simply too bulky. So I ended up settling for what I had, which still created a very interesting look. Perhaps a bolter round either glanced off or exploded right atop the shoulder pad, destroying his pauldron, however in the process protecting his hand from something that otherwise would have ruined it. And keeping with the theme of this kill team having awesome helmets, I had this really cool Mark III helmet, and grabbing one of the Chaos pauldrons. As this kill team no longer has the resources of a full chapter, they don't have a functional way to repair their armor when it gets heavily damaged, or to replace it with something non-heretical, resulting in them scavenging Chaos armor. As I'm sure this guy gets tired of holding this blade all day long, we need to give him a holster so he has somewhere to put it. Not to mention, it comes with several grenades that are definitely going to be very useful. I also slightly repositioned the holster to what I thought would be a bit more of a natural pose. And the shoulder pad damage was a really awesome suggestion, and I think it adds a lot of character and tells a really cool story for this guy. Next up, I had another great suggestion to use Tyranid bits to showcase that they've scavenged some Xenos as well. While I originally wanted to use a Tyranid shoulder pauldron, unfortunately ended up using it on the previous project of the Black Shields. So instead, I found this really cool Tyranid blade and I thought it would make a great compromise. Until I realized I was an idiot and I was trying to attach the left arm to a right hand. So instead, I found a left arm that was holding this sensor, that I thought I could perhaps say that it's actually some sort of a grenade. It slipped off my fingers seconds later and unfortunately shattered as the connection was just very tiny. So I went with the original idea, but this time grabbing the right arm for the right hand. But at this point, if the frustration of doing this wasn't enough, I managed to do my favorite thing of working with super glue, and I glued it to my finger. And while it's a great party trick, having that sensation of the crusty super glue in your finger is never pleasant. After attaching the arm holding the Tyranid blade, I had to figure out some way to make a left hand hold a grenade. And while at the moment it does look like he's waving hello to one of his friends, I'll be changing them momentarily by attaching some grenades to it, making it an entirely different kind of greeting. And because it's been so fun making him, I decided to give him a Nurgle pauldron to symbolize that he's a little stinker. Then I gathered all the different grenade pouches I could find in that little collection. With this, getting to the actual fun part of this model, which is going to be attaching all of these grenades wherever I can. I also had the brilliant idea of actually giving him a Nurgle helmet because let's be honest, it doesn't matter how much he cleans it or washes, the Nurgle stench is going to stay in there. Next time, he'll know better than to make me work with super glue. Luckily, the process of attaching all the little grenade pouches was actually really pleasant and relaxing. For the location, I decided to go for the hips as I thought it'd be a very easy place for him to reach, as well as giving him an additional grenade pouch on his back. However, even with all that, it just didn't feel like it was enough. So I took an actual underbarrel grenade launcher, cutting off the little bandolier holding all the grenades. And with my incredibly sweaty fingers from the fact that it was incredibly hot in my house, doing my absolute best to position this incredibly rigid small part in the best way I could. I also think it looks very similar to the official grenade pouch that the Assault Intercessor is holding in his left arm. With all of this in mind, I do hope I attached enough grenades so that this guy can be instantly recognized as the Grenadier. Even though I had quite a few frustration with his stinker, I think in the end he turned out absolutely awesome, and the idea to use the Tyranid blade worked out phenomenally. I then thought that it'd be a really good idea to add a lot more weathering to my Scavengers. So I took the drill and started making random holes into all of the models I made so far. Then grabbing the X-Acto knife and trying to make those little holes a little bit wider and more rough. For the pattern, I'm imagining that someone's in a massive panic as they see this massive Primaris hauling at them. I noticed several spray lines, so I used some Tamiya thin cement to essentially melt through them. By this point, the enthusiasm of drilling all the holes got the best of me, as it ended up actually drilling through the entirety of the model. I guess someone got off a very lucky shot and it did penetrate in the end. Now comes the most important member of the kill team, the leader of this band of Scavengers. The only two pieces I knew I was going to start with was going to be this plasma pistol and the chainsword. From here on out, it was essentially the Wild West, as I had no idea where I wanted to take this model. Unfortunately, the process of attaching his arm wasn't as smooth as I wanted. The hole from the push-to-fit model created a lot of the issues, as there was no good way to secure the arm to it. I did fill it up with spray glue, however that usually takes time to set in, so I had to make sure that it didn't peel off during the process. For the left pauldron, I decided to go for something a little bit more ornamental, matching of a leader, and a regular chaos one for the right one. And the moment I compared these two heads, I instantly realized what it was gonna make this guy into. I also wanted to create the idea that he's not just a battle leader, but he's also someone who's actively gathering intelligence on the battlefield and then redistributing it to the rest of the team. I remember an obscure piece of lore where Space Marines can technically gather intelligence from eating the brains of their enemies. So I wanted to attach his head to the back of his body to sort of create an automated version of that. But it looked a little bit awkward, so instead I just settled for the classical aspects to the front of his body. While this guy was turning out really awesome, I did want to add something else to further reinforce that idea. So I reached back into the Horus Heresy kit where I got this head and pulled out this really cool communication box. I also had to be extra careful as the two pins connecting it were very small and I did not want to move it about. And with this, the charismatic leader and the Grand Strategist was looking really awesome. But now I had to make sure that everybody was painted up and looking as awesome as they could be. Ironically enough, I had to start off by referencing my own video to see how exactly did I paint these models. It's only been several weeks since that video, but it was already enough time for me to forget the entire process entirely. I was a bit worried that I wouldn't be able to replicate the paint scheme exactly one-to-one, however, my worry was absolutely unwarranted because I managed to replicate it exactly the same. As I was painting, I still wanted to be cautious, so I chose to work in very thin layers, taking my time and making sure that the color scheme would still be very similar to what I painted previously. When it came to the stippling pattern, I did try something different with these models. I decided to use a little bit extra water so that when I am applying my stippling, it spreads out a little bit on the surface of the model. Stippling with a dry brush uses a lot more force, and as a result, I'm doing a lot more damage to my brush than if I'm using a lot more water with it. With this, the pattern did start looking lightly like a camouflage, and I actually enjoyed that quite a bit. Using a dark red color, I chose to accentuate some of the areas on the armors, as well as all the different grenades on the Grenadier. With this, I'm hoping to make a lot more visual contrast and just make the models a lot more interesting to look at. For the leather, just going for a very dark color. When I began applying all the metallics, it did surprise me how many different metal parts I actually ended up having on these models. As I was applying it to all those areas, I did decide to make a change to my previous color scheme. Instead of using chrome, I decided to use a very warm and bright bronze color. With this change in mind, I decided to instead dull down the armor on all of my miniatures. So I applied a wash with a little bit more concentration so that the armor would also get a little bit darker, giving the blue of the armor a much more of a dusk appearance, which I also thought would be a much better match for the lore of the chapter. Originally, I painted this Tyranid blade in a very dark turquoise color, however, I thought it looked a little bit too similar to the armor. Instead, I pulled a bright green color and decided to create the idea that this blade is actually some sort of a crazy Tyranid bioweapon. For the lenses, I simply used pure red in the most saturated form and then applied a little bit of pink to it. With a tiny amount of skin exposed on the leader, I decided to just use a little bit of Bugman glow and then warm it up with a little bit of white. We get to my favorite section of the entire painting process, the OSL. I start off by mixing some frog green with a little bit of black to create the background for my screen. Afterwards, I use a little bit of frog green on its own to write on essentially a little bit of a text. I did try using frog green through an airbrush to create much more of a casual OSL effect, however, I just really didn't like the effect. So instead, I tried applying some manual highlights with the frog green, and this part actually took quite a bit, as I ended up trying to edge highlight a lot of the areas, as well as try to get a little bit brighter on the screen. Unfortunately, I ended up working far too much on the screen and created an effect that I actually did not really like in the end. So afterwards, I actually went back to the previous iteration where it was just a very dark screen with some text on it. For the plasma weapon, I decided to use a very emerald looking color. By using a very warm green for the Auspex as well as a very cold blue for the plasma weapon, I was hoping to create an unconscious effect for where the armor is actually looking a lot more blue than it actually is in reality. By giving our brain two reference color of what greens actually look like, I'm essentially helping to cement the fact that the armor is indeed blue. Whereas in reality, this armor technically has a hint of green pigment in it, as the color I used is called Anthracite from AK Interactive, which is actually a very dark turquoise color. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, liking and leaving a comment does help out a massive amount. And with that, let's see the final result. If you haven't already, make sure to check out the previous video. I do go over the process of what makes these miniature scavengers and how they ended up in this very strange situation.